name is Adam Pena. Before I like to begin, would just like to say, throughout this presentation, if I do not seem nervous in any way, please do not let me fool you. I am actually quite nervous, given that this is my first, or perhaps one of my first international audiences. But I would like to start with this story. There's a man in his mid-40s with 2 daughters who finds out he needs an organ transplant, specifically a kidney. He then goes to Facebook, perhaps realizing that ordinary selection processes for transplantation would not afford him enough time, and so uses Facebook to actually solicit donors directly. And in the process finds 3 willing donors, I believe one of whom is a match. Unfortunately, is not able to find any physicians that would be willing to perform the transplant, given their sense of being uncomfortable with it, or perhaps saying that the person does not have a substantial relationship to the candidate. This story may seem familiar to some of you, as it's based on an actual case that actually happened within this country within this year, just a few months ago, actually. This, among other cases, are exemplar cases of what happens when social media and transplantation interact. And although there are perhaps not many ethical concerns, we've become to see that there are emerging ethical concerns, and as it stands right now, there is a lack of professional consensus and ethical consensus in bioethics generally, and clinical ethics specifically, about the question, what is the ethically appropriate use of social media within the context of transplantation? And so to first start, I would like to identify different uses of social media and social networking sites within the transplant arena, then move to discuss ethical considerations of social networking sites and social media within the context of organ transplantation, and then lastly, briefly address preliminary recommendations about the ethically appropriate use of social media and social networking sites. I would also first like to highlight 2 sets of values that act as a foundation for social media and organ transplantation. Social media tends to value interconnectedness, creating a global community of personal relationships outside, or perhaps outside the context of physical space. A total type of sharing, all while being efficient and immediate to a larger global community. There's another set of values that organ transplantation is founded upon: public trust, community, solidarity, justice in terms of allocation decisions and the fair allocation of available organs, transparency, and even perhaps concerns related to privacy and confidentiality. And while I would argue that these 2 sets of values in and of themselves do not conflict in every circumstance, as we've begun to see in most recent cases that are controversial and pose controversial questions, these 2 sets of values can actually begin to compete. And from there arise ethical concerns, and I think it comes from, or the root of it tends to come from, a sharing, transparency, and efficiency and immediacy that social media values. There are many uses of social media within the transplantation arena, and there will be ever-increasing uses of social media. While I would argue that perhaps they may seem somewhat controversial, many studies published in numerous journals have actually demonstrated that social media outlets are actually having a positive impact to some extent upon organ donation initiatives and organ transplantation initiatives, which I offer support for. Now, one potential use of social media within the transplantation arena is for means of public discussion and debate. This has actually taken form in a Facebook forum page where users are able to publicly discuss and debate the controversial decision to allocate adult lungs into a pediatric patient, which was actually decided in court, a US case known as the Sarah Murrigan case. Another use of social media would be to increase the organ supply and increase donation rates. This takes the form of an organ donor e-card, which is a mobile app that users can download and indicate their status via this app. I'm going to leave aside the question of whether or not this is a legally recognized mechanism of actually indicating status, but nonetheless, users are actually able to indicate their status via this mobile app. Another third use of social media has been direct solicitation of donors. As I mentioned in the case earlier, one of the controversial cases is that this individual actually went to Facebook to directly solicit donors. And while here, perhaps the question is left to an advisory committee, which I just learned perhaps has come to some consensus about this decision or question, there is a larger question beyond whether there's ethical support for individuals to use Facebook as a form of directly soliciting donors. The larger question that perhaps is left unanswered at this point is whether or not there is a role or an ethically supportable role for social media within the transplantation arena. Let's see. There we go. As we move towards looking at some of the ethical considerations, I'd first like to start looking at existing frameworks, regulatory frameworks and schemes. Unlike many other areas of medicine, transplantation is already policy-driven, heavily policy-driven, and has a number of existing frameworks. And while I'm focusing on specific regulatory frameworks for the EU, the ethical considerations that emerge within these documents are actually generalizable to other countries that share the same ethical concerns. In looking at these three documents, there seems to be an overarching goal to ensure the quality and safety of organs by focusing on transplantation processes and improving transplantation systems at multiple levels, whether that be the state, the nation, or perhaps internationally. And in looking at these documents, there seems to be four major ethical considerations, although not an exhaustive list, related to potential coercion, comparable advantage, information, or perhaps the potential for misinformation, and public trust. And as we begin to look at potential coercion, there seems to be a concern that there may be a developing system of trafficking human beings for the intention of procuring their organs. And while there are priority actions set in place within these documents, I might argue that they may be somewhat short-sighted, because they do not take into account the new dimensions and new aspects that social media introduces. There seems to be a concern here related to violation of physical integrity, a violation of personal autonomy where an individual can no longer gift organ to another but is coerced into doing so. And with the use of social media, this concern about potential coercion may increase for two specific reasons. One, related to the fact that generally there is a lack of oversight over the information users generate on social networking sites, coupled with a widespread accessibility and availability of information to a larger audience on social networking sites. Based upon this, it's not hard to then consider a scenario where an organization may actually then use a public forum page, or perhaps set up a fake Facebook page soliciting donors, intentionally luring in donors as a means of a scam and perhaps using that as a mechanism for human trafficking. Another related concern, pardon me, there we go, is related to comparable advantage. This clearly has implications for justice, and more specifically, distributed justice, in terms of fair allocation decisions. However, with the introduction of social media, there tends to be a concern, or at least an emerging concern, related to a moral model of selection of candidates versus the already accepted and ethically supportable medical model of selection of candidates. Where have we seen this? Is there really any reason to be concerned about this? And I would argue that perhaps there is. There was a young individual in the United States who is actually a candidate to receive a heart transplant. There were significant psychosocial concerns noted prior to this individual receiving the heart transplant. However, these psychosocial concerns were not contraindications in and of themselves, and in fact, there were not any medical contraindications related to this person's candidacy. The individual received the heart, and shortly thereafter was actually killed in a police car chase. The police believed that he had committed a crime, which gave more credence to the psychosocial concerns that were noted prior to the transplantation. This case, known as the Anthony Stokes case in the United States, became a social media and mass media frenzy, where the question then became whether or not this individual was morally worthy to have received an organ based on these psychosocial concerns. And this discussion took place outside the context of whether or not this individual actually had medical indications that made him an appropriate candidate to receive the heart. Now, what's more concerning is that this conversation grew from this individual case to whether or not transplantation selection processes should include, to some extent, an aspect of considering whether or not an individual is morally worthy to receive a transplant, versus the already accepted medical model of selecting candidates based upon medical indications or contraindications. Secondly, there may be this introduction of personal biases. As I mentioned earlier, there are already transplant processes set in place based upon a medical model of selection that is meant to offset personal biases, or perhaps physician or clinician biases related to an individual's candidacy. However, with the use of social media, it's not hard to envision where two potential candidates then go on Facebook to create a Facebook page soliciting donors. Let's take, for instance, the first case I mentioned earlier, a young father of two directly soliciting donors for a kidney transplant. And let's then say that there's another individual of perhaps a different ethnicity, a different person, different narrative, who then goes to Facebook to actually do the same thing. Now the potential donor has access really only to the information on Facebook outside whether or not this person, this potential candidate, actually has outside the context of whether there's medical indications or contraindications about this person's candidacy. Given that they only have access to the Facebook page, it's not hard for them to then go through the rest of the Facebook page or perhaps even Google the individual. And let's say then that the potential donor finds that the second individual had a past criminal history. Based upon that information, which is really only a narrative, the potential donor introduces to some aspect in their decision-making process a personal bias, where they're going to have a personal bias towards the wholesome, perhaps father of two, versus the other potential candidate who has a past criminal history. This selection process that the donor is going through is solely relying upon a moral model of selection, which then has larger implications for a disruption of distribution schemes. There's also another related concern about information, perhaps even misinformation, which has implications then for a potential candidate or donor to have access to appropriate, accurate, and correct information related to transplant in order for that person to make an informed decision about transplantation and donation. However, with the widespread use and accessibility of social networking sites, users may then actually be exposed to misinformation related to organ donation and transplantation, which has implications for organ donation rates. The reason why I say this is there was actually the Eurobarometer study, or perhaps the Eurobarometer of 2009, and the Gallup poll in the United States, which actually demonstrated that one of the reasons individuals were not willing to become donors, or perhaps decided not to donate their organs, was based upon a lack of familiarity with transplantation and transplantation processes in general. If users are exposed to misinformation related to transplantation, then it may be that this only compounds the lack of familiarity with transplantation processes and indirectly promotes what are called myths about transplantation. One being, for example, that perhaps immigrants or individuals of third world countries receive suboptimal care, so that way at the time of death, people will be able to procure their organs. Or perhaps another myth related to the fact that transplantation processes, and especially new and innovative transplantation processes, are actually purely experimental and not scientifically based. While this may seem somewhat ludicrous to our ears, or perhaps to a majority of people here, have we seen this yet? And we actually have. In the forum or the public discussion forum page that I mentioned earlier, one user actually alluded to the Sarah Murtigan case as purely experimental, that the parents were subjecting their daughter to a purely experimental process. And although this information was not presented in a sophisticated manner, given that this was a public forum and debate, there was large buy-in from other users of this social networking site. Lastly, there is, and finally, a significant ethical concern related to public trust. And as we see, if perhaps these concerns related to potential coercion, misinformation, and comparable advantage are not discussed within the context of social media, then it may be that this will dissuade the community, the larger community, from participating in organ donation and transplantation, which of course then has implications for donation rates and ultimately weakens solidarity between the larger community and the transplant community, where the transplant community to some extent actually depends upon the larger community or individuals within the larger community who are willing to donate their organs or become an organ donor. And as we take a step back now and look at these four major ethical considerations that are intended to ensure the quality and safety of organs, I propose that perhaps if these concerns are not addressed within the context of social media, most efforts related to ensuring the quality and safety of organs will become frustrated and not achieve their intended goal. Or perhaps otherwise put, these types of initiatives will operate at a substandard level. And so in order to offset this concern, I would at least like to offer some preliminary recommendations related to encouraging professional societies or heads of professional societies in conjunction with ethicists to develop statements on the ethically appropriate use of social media in order to generate some professional consensus, because we currently lack that. Secondly, those working within these societies on social media platforms or different organ transplantation organizations or organ donation organizations can begin to collaborate with social media leadership to promote the ethically appropriate use of social media and develop different strategies to do so. One potential strategy could then be to direct users to websites where information is subject to quality control and oversight. Secondly, there may be then another strategy to help enhance Facebook's privacy settings or social networking sites, enhance their privacy settings such that those who have received a transplant and are online, creating some type of online community, may be actually free and able to share information among themselves while offsetting concerns related to privacy and confidentiality. And so with that, I hope that in this presentation I've been able to highlight some ethical concerns related to social media in the context of transplantation, but more importantly, at least highlight that there's room to grow and to develop strategies to offset these concerns in order to, if anything, improve already existing mechanisms, social media mechanisms, to ultimately promote organ transplantation initiatives and organ donation initiatives. And with that, I'd like to say thank you very much for your attention and this opportunity to speak with you today.